So welcome, everyone. My name is Brenda Morrison. I am the co-director of the Center for Restorative Justice because I feel Liz is very much with me and will always be with me, and so I'm the co-director still of the Center for Restorative Justice. Welcome here to what no doubt will be a wonderful event. It feels a little bit too formal because I recognize so many faces in the crowd as I look around the room, and I feel we should be just mingling and socializing, and probably that's what Liz would be wanting us to do. She was the hummingbird that opened all of our hearts, so it's great to be here in circle with you, and we're very honored to have Howard with us. There's a special group that I'd like to acknowledge as being here, and that's Liz's family. So in the order that they got to know and love Liz Elliott, I'd like to call upon her brother, Peter Elliott, her husband and life partner, Milt, and then I think the next person who came along was Chris, and then Maya, and then by affiliation, Claire. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the lecture, and we'll talk later.
Thank you, Brenda. So it's a great pleasure, immense pleasure, and thanks, because he's come a long way at relatively short notice, to introduce to you Dr. Howard Zaire. Probably needs no introduction at all. I think he's rightly known as the grandfather of restorative justice. That in North America, that actually is Howard's preferred moniker. I didn't think he was that old, but as a grandfather myself, I'm sensitive to these sorts of things. Howard is a professor of restorative justice at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Those of you who do not know, he has a series of beautiful photography albums, books that are available. I find them just utterly fascinating. And of course, the minute I found out that he was a photographer, it then made sense to go back to Changing Lenses, which was a book that started it all. Anyway, Howard.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming out this afternoon. I'm really, really honored to be asked to kick off this series. You know, we've lost a friend, a resource, a prophet, an exceptional person, and I hope this series will be a real celebration of her life and work and memory. About a year ago, I got a phone call from a mother in Florida who said that her son had recently killed his girlfriend. His case had not come to trial, had not even been pled yet, but she said she wanted restorative justice. And I have to admit, my first reaction was a little jaded because restorative justice often sounds good to the offender side of the equation. But then she said something really interesting. She said, the young woman, mother, told me about you and about restorative justice. And so I knew something was different. So I talked to her a little bit, and this case had not even, as I said, not gone to trial, had not been pled or anything. And I said, well, you need more than a restorative justice facilitator. You need a lawyer, a restorative justice lawyer, because there's going to be lots of legal issues involved. So I called my friend Sujatha Baliga in California, and I told her about this, and she said, well, I can't do that. I do family group conferences to keep kids of color out of prison and to help victims, but I don't do that kind of case. And I said, I know it won't work, but just call her. And she did, and it led to a most incredible journey. She used to call, Sujatha would call me in the middle of it and say, I don't know if I'm therapist or lawyer. But eventually, what happened, she contacted defense attorneys. They had no restorative justice in this jurisdiction. So the defense attorney thought she was nuts, and the prosecutor, again, thought she was nuts. But she eventually pulled together at in the American Capitol, well, it was a potential death penalty case when she called me. In an American trial, there's something called the pre-plea conference. And usually what happens is the defense attorney and the prosecutor are present and no one else is present, and they duke it out about what the charges are going to be and so forth. She got an agreement to do a family group conference inside the jail for this plea. And so she brought into this jail, she brought the defense attorney and the prosecutor and the victim's family and the offender and his family and a priest. And they said, Sujatha called it 5 hours of sorrow, confessions, trauma, love, and forgiveness. The family got to hear what actually happened. They got to honor the daughter that was lost. Julie McBride, the mother of the young man who did this, said at times what felt like the cinder block walls in that tiny room would crack from the sorrow and heartache that poured forth. Sujatha says, looking back, I think those jail walls did crack, not from the sorrow and heartache, but from the honesty and bravery and willingness to try something our criminal justice system rarely sees, to include victims in deciding what happens to people who did them unthinkable harm, and a chance for wrongdoers to begin to replace the irreparable before that case ever reaches the courthouse doors. The sentence eventually, both families wanted to have a relatively short prison term. Both families wanted about a maximum of 10 years because they wanted Connor to come out and do education around date violence in schools. The prosecutor said he'd have to think about it. He went back and consulted other people in the community, and he came back and he offered 20 years, more than what they would have liked, but much less than he would have normally have gotten. The prosecutor said, there's no way I would have, based on the facts and circumstances, agreed to a sentence this lenient had they not asked me and sincerely expressed how important it was to allow them to heal. Now, today, those families are restorative justice advocates. Now, probably most of us don't experience what we might call the call of service, the call to do justice, to build peace, as dramatically as the McBrides or the Gromeyers or Sujatha. Some of us might, in fact, be uncomfortable with the term service, but my sense is that each of you who is involved in restorative justice in some way feels a call or a pull to be doing what you're doing. Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker described it like this. She said, there is a call to us, a call to service, that we join each with others to try to make things better in this world. Even though our motivation may or may not be religious, I think that's what motivates much of restorative justice. I've taken the phrase the call of service from a title of a book by Dr. Robert Coles of the Harvard University Medical School. Cole has tried throughout his life, through attentive listening and appreciative understanding, to understand what he calls the moral energy that activates those heroes. He notes that the call to service is a call to a new chapter in life. And perhaps that is how many of you see this work, as a kind of call, an invigorating mission. At least that's what I picked up from so many people I've interacted with over these years. It may sound surprising, but it's what I picked up from a group of lawyers who I pulled together last weekend for a retreat. Lawyers who are trying to do restorative justice in their practice. Lawyers ranging from personal injury work to death penalty work, and who are finding a way to encourage each other in their work. We often talk about restorative justice as a field of theory and a field of practice, but what I want to talk to you right now about is about you, about us, because if we don't hang in there, none of this is going to happen. Cole subtitles his book, A Witness to Idealism, but he isn't naive. Idealism often becomes weariness, and that in turn can become cynicism, which can lead to self-righteousness and despair, and that in turn leads to depression and burnout. He quotes Dr. Martin Luther King, who is one of my heroes. I graduated from the school where Dr. Martin Luther King graduated, and I had the opportunity to meet him once. Burnout, says King, is surrender. We have just so much strength in us. If we give and give and give, we have less and less and less. After a while, at a certain point, we're so weak and worn, we hoist up the flag of surrender. We surrender to the worst side of ourselves, and then we display that to others. We surrender to self-pity and to spite and to morose self-preoccupation. If you want to call it depression or burnout, well, all right. If you want to call it triumph of sin, well, all right. Whatever we say and think, this is arduous duty. This is doing a hard kind of work, to live out one's idealism with all of its hazards. So shrillness and moodiness and humorlessness, a tendency to take oneself too seriously, these are some of the signs of an idealism that's in trouble. Now, I often quote from an American environmentalist, Edward Abbey, who gave us some advice about how to ward this off. He calls us to be a half-hearted fanatic. And I like this idea of a half-hearted fanatic. Here's a longer quote. Do not burn yourself out. Be a reluctant enthusiast, a part-time crusader, a half-hearted fanatic. Save the other half of yourselves and your lives for pleasure and adventure. So get out there and breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate the precious stillness, the lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. Enjoy yourselves. Keep your brain in your head and your head firmly attached to the body active and alive, and I promise you this much. I promise you this one sweet victory over our enemies, over those desk-bound men and women with their hearts in safe deposit boxes and their eyes hypnotized by desk calculators. I promise you this, you will outlive the bastards. Well, I'm not sure it's helpful to see things quite that adversarial, but I think the point is right. We do need to take care of ourselves and the organizations we work with. To take time to really enjoy life, to remember that the world will go on without us and that we aren't responsible for fixing everything. Andre Brink, the South African novelist, has a character with a line that I always remember. He says there are two great myths in the world. One is that we can do nothing, and the other is that we can do everything. And to me, restorative justice is in that space between trying to do everything and doing nothing. So my first point is that for many of us, restorative justice is a calling. And secondly, a sense of call or mission isn't enough to sustain us. We need to take care of ourselves and to have a life. And that leads me to a third point, and that is that we'll be less lonely and more successful if restorative justice can become a true social movement. Now, I draw here for a bit from a talk by Lawrence Sherman at a conference in England a few years ago, and then from a follow-up analysis by one of my former students, Sula Pefkaris, who was at that point one of my students. Sherman says, given the ample evidence that restorative justice is effective, that it works, why hasn't it taken off more than it has? He goes on to argue that it has not reached a tipping point because it hasn't become a true social movement, not in the sense of the civil rights movement, say, or the anti-slavery movement in England. He said the key is in becoming a mass social network. And he makes some interesting analogies looking at the anti-slavery movement in Britain, or the so-called American Revolution. Now, whether it has taken off or not depends on your perspective. When I look back to late 1970s when we all started thinking about this thing, it's certainly a much more of a movement than it was then. But it's not a true social movement in the sense of the civil rights movement in the United States. Now, Sula wasn't sure that that anti-slavery analogy was all that helpful, because she said it's really hard to condense restorative justice into a simple slogan like end slavery. And he said even though slavery was embedded in an industry, it probably wasn't as deep and prosperous and established an industry as this corrections industrial complex we at least have in the United States. And she worried about trying to change policies without addressing the overall cultural context because of the possibilities of things going wrong, and I'm going to talk more about that. She goes on for arguing to develop a social movement, and she draws on a bias of mine and one of Liz's, and that is that you really need to start at home, a homegrown movement produced in one's own backyard, in a sense, from the community up, or in New Zealand we might say from the flax roots up. So she's not sure we should actually be pushing to make restorative justice a movement yet. Maybe we have more work to do in our own gardens. In many ways, that's what I think many of us are trying to do. We do need to strengthen the social movement. We do need to strengthen our infrastructure. We do need to sustain ourselves and engage our communities. And maybe it isn't so bad that we aren't at a tipping point yet. Maybe we have more homework to do before we get that point. We'll be sustained in the long term if we can be clear about what we advocate. That is, if restorative justice can be a clear moral compass, and as I'll argue in a minute, a compass with a needle. Now, most of you know a lot about restorative justice, and I don't need to review that, but I will say briefly how I think of restorative justice. And I like to think of it in threes, that a just response calls us to acknowledge and repair harm. Secondly, to accept our responsibilities. And third, engage everyone who has a stake in this thing or been involved in it in addressing the needs. And under that are three values. One of them is respect. That essentially, I think restorative justice is about providing an experience of respect for everyone involved. Secondly is responsibility. It reminds us that we are responsible for our actions, and that when my actions negatively impact somebody, I have a responsibility. And third is relationship. At least in the U.S., we live in a society that focuses on rights of the individual, and we so infrequently remind ourselves of our relationships. And I think restorative justice is a call back to those relationships. And underlying that for me are three aspirations. The desire to live in right relationship with myself, with each other, and with the creation. So whether it's a typical crime or hockey riots, it's about addressing harms, about meeting needs, and addressing obligations, ideally through collaborative dialogical processes that reflect these values that I've just named. So I think restorative justice provides a framework for addressing a whole variety of situations. But maybe it's more than that. Liz claimed it was. She quoted me, I didn't remember saying this, but she says I said it. She said, restorative justice is a kind of coherent value system that gives us a vision of the good. Now let me explain that a little bit. For years I've had a weird experience of people coming up to me and saying things like, restorative justice is a way of life. And I couldn't figure out what in the world they were talking about for a long time. And then I got to thinking about it. If you think about the criminal justice system, the legal system is designed to set certain boundaries, to tell us how to live together. And it says, if you don't do this, then we are going to, if you harm people, we're going to harm you back. And that in itself is not a vision of the good. And so what we have to do is we have to reach for other ethical values and bring it in to mitigate and shape this response. I think restorative justice, being value-based, being principle-based, contains within it a vision of the good, of how we want to live together. And that's why I think some people call it a way of life. For Liz, it was a way of living together. It's best if values are lived rather than being rules to enforce, she said. This goes beyond individuals and those around us. She said, a goal of restorative justice is to animate values in a broader group than just the immediate stakeholders. Individual responsibility is the focus of the criminal justice system. Restorative justice processes, which are more inclusive of supporters and the community at large, afford the potential for examining responsibility and other values in a broader context. This, she said, means that restorative justice holds promise as a form of community development. It is a commitment to mutual care, to an ethic of care. Another quote, restorative justice processes create environments in which reflection and on experiences of an event can help everyone affected to learn and grow. In other words, restorative justice can use these kind of situations as a catalyst for learning, as an opportunity for learning. This vision of mutuality is actually supported by neuroscience and attachment theory. The new neuroscience is teaching us that we, as human beings, our brains are designed to connect with other people. They are, you know, if you watch an infant as they just barely begin to mature, they look at you, they're trying to connect. And I heard several neuroscientists looking at restorative justice say that the brain is designed to connect with other people, and healthy learning, healthy neural pathways are our learning mechanism. And if we are abused as children or don't bond with our parents or neglected, those neural pathways get distorted. And this neuroscientist who was looking at restorative conferences said, you know why it works? He said nothing reprograms the brain faster than an experience of empathy, because the brain is designed to work that way. We are wired to connect. So restorative justice is a kind of moral compass. It tells us a direction which we should go. But Dorothy Vandering, who's here tonight, has written that maybe it's a compass but hasn't had an adequate needle. She says that part of the problem has been ambiguity in understanding of restorative justice, and that has led to confusion. It's led to bad practice, and even the field sometimes being discredited. She believes that the concept of justice is essential. You can't drop the idea of justice. You know, when we talk about restorative practices, the danger is there we've lost the justice component. She's arguing that justice is important, but we have to have a clear understanding of justice. Otherwise, the compass is missing a needle. And she says that this understanding must be based on what it means to be human. So we need to understand what it needs to be human. And she said, one in which justice is identified as honoring the inherent worth of all enacted through relationships. So recognizing the dignity and worth of all, but enacted through relationship. So these two foci, honor of the individual, dignity of the individual, and relationships can provide the needle we need for this moral compass. Harm violates both honor and relationship, and restorative justice should try to address those things. A quote from Dorothy. If restorative justice acknowledges justice as honoring the inherent worth of all and is enacted through relationships, as such, it affects all social structures. When something occurs that undermines the well-being of some, restorative justice provides a space for dialogue so that humanity of all individual and affected can be restored, and each person can once again become a fully contributing member of the community of which they are part. So restorative justice is not just something that applies to crime or when someone does something specifically wrong. It's a way of being together as people. Increasingly for me then, restorative justice is not just about crime or addressing wrong. It's a way of approaching our life together. It's about building, maintaining, and repairing healthy relationships. So let's be clear what restorative justice is, find ways to apply it to our lives beyond our work and retain our idealism. But let's be half-hearted fanatics in another way. Let's not let our idealism, enthusiasm, blind us to our shortcomings and challenges. And this brings me back to a very important point, the point of this vision. You know, the history of restorative justice reform in the U.S. has been a dismal one. It seems like every reform we try ends up being something different than intended and often worse than what we're trying to repair. David Cayley, in his important book, Expanding Prison, it's sort of out of print, but you can still get it. It still can be printed if you're interested in this. He was originally a series on CBC that he turned into a book. But he pointed out the lessons from the 80s, the 70s, and 80s are really instructive. What happened was that a critique of rehabilitation coincided with a radical critique of power. And that led both progressives and conservatives to decide that we should take the discretion out of the system. We should just agree to punish people in what came to be called the just desserts philosophy. So in place of the rehabilitative philosophy that had been in place that had led to so much abuse, we put into place a just desserts philosophy. What was lacking was any kind of, Cayley says, was any kind of positive vision. We had the negatives. We knew what we didn't want, but we had no positive vision to guide us. And the result in my country is mass incarceration and the incredible reinforcement of punitive values. I sit on the Victim Advisory Group of the U.S. Sentencing Commission. The U.S. Sentencing Commission oversees federal sentencing guidelines for the United States. When you look at those sentencing guidelines, it's scary. Every year I get my new guide, about this thick, and it has all these formulas about how judges are supposed to decide what punishment an offender gets, and as a kind of pseudo-scientific calculation. I think restorative justice can provide that missing vision, the vision that was missing in the 70s, 80s, and 80s. But I always tell my students, every social intervention has unintended consequences. No matter how good our motives may be, our interventions are going to have unintended consequences. And it's up to us to be aware of that. All of our approaches have hidden biases, implications, possibilities that we never imagined. And our duty, I think, is to be aware and mindful of them. One of the most hostilely received talks I ever gave was in the early part of this movement when a gathering of restorative justice practitioners. I did a speech on the dangers ahead, and everybody was like, why are you talking about this negative stuff? But we have to embrace it. We have to talk about it. We have to be aware of it. It's really hard for idealists, I think, but it's really important. So remember, our critics are often doing us a service when they ask questions and raise concerns. We need to balance, I think, our idealism and our realism So let's be realistic idealists. How's that? And let's be accountable to our principals, just as we ask our so-called clients to be accountable. I want to mention two specific concerns. There are many things I could talk about. One of them that really concerns me, at least in my environment, is whether we are being really living up to our promise to victims. We claim to do restorative justice as a way of addressing victims' needs and giving them a voice, but so often I see that our efforts are driven by a concern to do something with offenders, positively or negative. There's such a tendency, given how skewed our legal systems are toward dealing with the offender, there's such a tendency to leave the victim out or to use the victims in some way. So one of them that I'm spending a lot of time on is that issue. How can we live up in restorative justice to the promise we've made to victims? The other one is this issue of mass incarceration. In the U.S., we have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prisoners in the world. The vast majority of those are people of color. In the U.S., we now incarcerate more people of color than South Africa ever did at the height of apartheid. I just finished co-authored a book about children of prisoners. 3 million kids in America have a parent in prison on any given day. And when we finished the book, we were a little worried that so many of these were kids of color. And when I looked at the statistics, they almost entirely matched the population of American prisons. 1 in 15 young African-American children in the U.S. has a parent in prison. 1 in 110 white child has a parent in prison. It tells you something about the disparity. Well, Canada may or may not be that bad, but from what I'm gathering, they're starting to adopt some of our discredited prison policies at the very time that they're being discredited in the U.S. That so often happens. Interestingly, in the U.S., there's actually a conservative movement called Right on Crime that's arguing that we need to have alternatives to prison and reduce our prison population. So part of it is the numbers, but the other is the disparities in the system. There's a new book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, and she calls the American prison system a well-disguised system for racialized social control, similar to what in the U.S. we know as the Jim Crow era, but in race-neutral language. So my challenge is this: are we in restorative justice thinking adequately about how we address that phenomenon through restorative justice? Now, maybe the idea of restorative justice as a way of life is too lofty or a little too cheesy for you. Maybe it doesn't connect it at all for you to call it a way of life. But I do think it's nevertheless a value-oriented, principle-driven way of approaching life's situation. So I raise the several challenges. Can we put our egos aside instead of each trying to invent and promote our own models? One of the things that alarms me as I move around is the extent to which people's egos are involved and they're promoting their own models as better than other models and so forth. That's not very restorative. Can we move beyond that? Can we also apply restorative principles to our own organizations? In the U.S. in the last year or two, so many restorative justice programs and organizations are in trouble because the staff and the people who run them are fighting among themselves. Can we apply those things to our own lives? Can we be consistent in the application of restorative values even when we hit a roadblock in that practice? Our own Catherine Bargan has argued that restorative justice values are worth committing to until the practitioner hits significant roadblocks. And then too often we fall back on punishment or fear or domination to deal with those issues that we confront. So can we be more consistent and creative enough in restorative justice approaches, even in these difficult situations? I like to quote a former student, Dave Dick, from Winnipeg. Some of you may know him. When he came to our program, he had been a long-time mediator, practitioner, and people used to say to him, "You must have a great marriage with this background." He'd say, "Oh, I don't take my work home with me." So the question is, can we learn to take our work home with us? Can we be passionate with ourselves and others when we fail to do so? If we can do these things, even imperfectly, then maybe restorative justice can be, as Liz hoped, a part of a larger cultural change that will create a healthier, more caring, safer society, not only for ourselves, but for future generations. So to summarize my argument so far, restorative justice for many of us is a kind of calling, but idealism isn't enough. We need to take care of ourselves. We'll be less lonely and more successful if we can move toward creating a movement sort of from the ground up. We'll be sustained long term if restorative justice can be a kind of moral compass with a needle. But let's not let our enthusiasm get so much that it blinds us to our shortcomings and the challenges. And let's take our work home with us. Now, my final point is this. I suggest that we view our justice work with the eyes of an artist. You know, one problem with the legal system is that it privileges the rational and minimizes the emotional intuitive. Now, the rational and scientific is important, but as neuroscientist Dan Siegel said at a conference at our place last spring, we need to be scientifically consistent, but not scientifically constrained. I am convinced that justice is a matter of the whole person. It takes the whole medicine wheel. It's all of that. And it requires us to draw on multiple ways of not knowing, not just the scientific, not just the rational, but intuitive and creative and artistic as well. And increasingly, I am interested in arts-based approaches. I co-teach I call it a wacko course, but it's a lot of fun, a course called Research as Art and Transformation. And you may or may not know it, there's a whole emerging field called arts-based research that comes out of Toronto and other places that has been very influential for me. Well, let me suggest that Sujatha was being an artist when she put together that family group conference that helped the Gromers and the McBrides work through their grief. Let me move toward a conclusion by quoting a book that I picked up in a used bookstore. That's one of my main research mechanisms, going to used bookstores and finding books I didn't know existed, and it's one of my frustrations with all these used bookstores that are closing, but that's another topic. I picked up a book by Stephen Myers called On Seeing Nature, and he's talking about the art of seeing, but I think it applies equally to the art of justice. Myers reminds us that one's knowledge must never overcome one's awe, A-W-E, awe. As long as there is awe, there is seeing, he says. And then he continues. Seeing is a process, partly, of replacing our arrogance with humility. When we respect the reality which fills the abyss of our ignorance, we begin to see. Now let me read that again, rephrasing it. Doing justice is a process, partly, of replacing our arrogance with humility. When we respect the reality that fills out the abyss of our ignorance, only then can we begin to work toward peace and justice. He says seeing begins with respect, but wonder is the fuel which sustains vision. Myers goes on to outline some what he calls key components of aesthetic vision that help us to keep this wonder alive. And these might as well have been written for the justice worker. They include, he says, choosing specific problems to work on. That is, limiting the possibilities, not trying to do everything. He says it's finding pleasure in the process as well as the product or the outcome. It's relaxing the conscious effort and letting the unconscious have its place, including the importance of intuition. It's accepting accidental and unexpected experiences. And that's certainly true of my experience in restorative justice. So much is unexpected. Finally, Myers talks about mystery and ambiguity. He says the presence of ambiguity allows visual representations of nature to create a broader range of responses in a viewer than a careful and obvious articulation of details might. I think mystery and ambiguity are crucial for restorative justice, just as they are for the artist. Mystery and ambiguity, along with respect, allow space for the unexpected and for differing visions and perceptions to be expressed. In a class I was in years ago, spiritual director Pat Kaler said something I've never forgotten. Growth depends on an openness to mystery. We are called to openness, and sin is closing ourselves from mystery. So I think humility, respect, awe, wonder, these are key words for the justice artist. If we stay rooted in them, I think we will maybe stave off the wolves of despair. We'll be able to heed the call of service. Basic to all, perhaps, is an appreciation of the profound mystery of the human spirit. A book by Chet Ramo called Honey from Stone, A Naturalist's Search for God, another result of my systematic and scientific research method of looking around on the tables in used bookstores, comes to the same conclusion. He says, description is revelation, seeing is praise, and knowledge is an island surrounded by a sea of mystery. Well, my challenge in this work, and maybe it's yours, is not to build dikes around this so that we can reclaim that island of knowledge. My challenge, and maybe it's yours, is to learn how to float, and to float comfortably in this vast sea of mystery. It's a sea of mystery that only can be appreciated and approached in an attitude of awe and respect. It's an attitude that I find characteristic of the indigenous traditions on this continent. It's an attitude that I find characteristic of the spirit of Liz's spirit. So it's with such an attitude that I believe, characterized our friend Liz Elliott. So the best way to remember Liz, I think, is by approaching our work with an attitude of respect, of wonder, of humility, of mystery, of imagination. Thank you, Liz, for these invaluable gifts. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Is it working? Okay, awesome. You mentioned Texas, Dr. Zaire, and there was actually the Right on Crime representative in Texas mentioned when asked about the new crime bill in Canada. He said it's doomed to fail. What you'll do is waste a lot of money, and you'll increase recidivism and create lots of problems, and actually cost taxpayers more money, and you'll have a much more unsafe community. The judges involved with the program stated the same thing, corrections consultants and politicians. They've had a turnaround starting in, I think, 2005, and just recently, within the last couple of years, for the first time ever in Texas, they actually shut down one of their prisons. The last prisoners actually dismantled everything in there, and they're going to sell the facilities and the land. Very successful, what they have done there. And I mean, it's been incredibly good. Now, we're going the exact opposite direction at the federal level in Canada. And I was wondering, do you have any insights as to how, I mean, there are lots of egos involved in RJ and BC, what we see around. It's very much true. There is a lot of territorial discussions, I mean, who does which work in which area and everything else. But to come together as a group and actually be able to affect policy at the federal level, at the provincial level, any pathways you would suggest, or anybody else really on the panel, that could help us pull it together and actually be effective affecting policy?
I think this idea of providing an alternative vision is really important. We can say no to these things, we can show these limits, but unless we have an alternative vision, it's not going to last. So we need to think about how to articulate in a way that can be heard, that isn't sectarian, that can meet. We need to think about what politicians need and so forth. So I think it's really, that's part of it, is trying to articulate a vision. The problem we've had, and maybe you've had in Canada, is that crime has become so politicized in the last several decades that we can have almost no reasoned discussion in the public arena in the United States around crime. It's what politicians use to beat each other up with. It has diminished. The last presidential election, I was happy to see it was not a big issue, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be. So part of it is going to be, obviously I don't have a very easy answer for you, but I think having the vision as well as helping people see the downside of the policies that they're on. I mean, the U.S. is an incredible laboratory. It's done a lot of things, has a lot of lessons that we got to learn not to do. I think many of our innovations in criminal justice have been lessons that other people ought to avoid. I don't know what extent it's true here. We do have a huge industry in the United States. It's a huge lobby promoting it. We have, when the Cold War wound down, the armaments manufacturers, some of them went directly into corrections technology. And let me tell you, they're not lobbying for reduced use of prisons. So part of it, what we've been naive about, I think, on south of the border is just how to address that industry that's there as well. And again, I don't have a clear answer for you.
It's on the same note. From my vague recollection, New Zealand went through a real economic crisis, I think, in the 90s. Did they implement restorative justice coming out of that? Part of the recognition being they couldn't afford the other model. And is that a strategy to at least introduce it to politicians rather than saying the other way doesn't work?
Well, New Zealand in 1989 instituted what is the closest thing to for young people, a legal system organized around a kind of restorative justice. They did it, that was before that big economic crisis, but they had the highest incarceration rate for young people in the world. And they had a huge, and there was a huge racial disparities in their prisons and in the foster care system. So partly it was driven by the economic need to not have so many prisons. But the Maori came to the government in New Zealand and said, what you are doing is institutionally racist. And they made such a convincing case that the Western legal model, as they were experiencing it, was culturally inappropriate and beyond that, institutionally racist, that helped to create the change. Now, people in New Zealand tell me if they had to vote on it right now, it probably wouldn't pass. I mean, they had a window there of sensitivity around culture issues, about the pressures on the legal system that gave them an unusual window. They have been subject to a lot of the same political pressures around security and fear of crime and so forth that we have. And so they have never been able to fully incorporate it in the adult system. They have a high incarceration of adults. It's an unintended consequence, they tell me. It's a result of some laws that weren't intended to do that. But the juvenile justice, the youth, they don't call it juvenile justice, they call it youth justice. When it's working there, it's phenomenal. It's not always done right, but when it does, it's phenomenal. It reduced incarceration, it reduced crime rates, it just did a whole bunch of stuff. But it was only partly because of economic pressure. It was also the cultural pressure.
I'd just like to comment on the privatization part of the increase in incarceration rates, because I think that's definitely one of the big clues to stopping or eliminating. If you can eliminate the ability of private companies to turn public, to become publicly traded corporations, and therefore, like the big banks, just looking after their own regulations and everything, that may assist. But once you permit privatization, and there is nothing to stop the companies from going public, and once you can sell shares in jails, you're finished. It's just going to increase, increase, increase. And I think that the numbers in the states show that quite clearly. So it's just a comment, and I don't know if there is, a question in that. It's how do you stop privatization when governments are, increasingly handing contracts to private people to do all sorts of things that governments used to take care of, like, medical records, etc. Thanks.
I think the other part of this whole issue, though, is being much more conscious and deliberate about incorporating victims' needs into this process. We have these discussions about prison policy, but we often do it separate from any conversation around what victims need. My experience has been that there's a whole group of needs that I call justice needs that crime victims have. And when we address those needs, people are able to move on their journeys, and when they get stuck, it's often because those needs haven't been met. But all we offer them normally is punishment. The only thing a victim, the only thing we really offer them, it's like one victim advocate friend says of mine, there used to be a game show that had these, you want door number 1 or door number 2 or door number 3? She says, we really want door number 4, but nobody offers us door number 4. So I think part of this whole conversation needs to be a conversation with victims, victim services, and others around what victims' needs are and how they can be addressed in this process. And my experience, if we would incorporate that much more fully into the process, my experience has been it's not going to be more punitive, it's going to be less punitive, and people are going to be more satisfied by it. So that's the other piece that I think is really, we so often have these conversations around our prison policy without addressing the others, the victim part of it.
I was just curious, you were speaking early on in your lecture around the tipping point, and you just gave an example in New Zealand where you feel like that moment came and was taken advantage of. And I'm just wondering, in your observations or in this country, what exactly you think that would take in terms of shifting the attitudes and the actual actions that go with it. And as you were just speaking about victims as well, just some sort of victim revolution needs to take place in the sense of the people coming forward, having the sports come forward to make a stronger, a stronger case in terms of what they require. But of course, when they're victims, that's not the place in their life where they feel they can do that. So sort of two parts to that comment, but I was curious about your thoughts on a tipping point.
Well, I wouldn't begin to speak to Canadian policies. My wife's Canadian, but she doesn't keep up with it either, so I can't speak to the dynamics of that. To come back to the victim issue, I think we need a lot more dialogue. Well, let me back up this. We're doing some work in death penalty cases. You know, we realize that in the United States, in death penalty cases, they're the most adversarial experience you can imagine. I mean, they're totally adversarial. And the only thing the victim's being offered in this thing is a conviction and punishment. And we began to realize that there was a lot of other things the victim needed. They needed information about what happened, and they wanted things that only the offender really knew, but the legal system kept them from having any contact at all. So we began to train people to be a liaison between the defense and the victim, so that a surviving family member has access to the official victim services person, who tends to be more connected with the prosecutor, and to the defense side. And so they began we began to work with them. What do you really need out of this process? Well, they want their loved one to be honored. They want answers to questions. They want a chance to tell people what it did to them. I mean, they have a variety of things they need. And when they do that, often they decide they don't really want the death penalty. They want these other things more. To me, that's kind of a microcosm of the larger issue of how we talk with the victim community around what their options are, what their needs are, how we can incorporate their voices into that more. I don't know if that speaks to your policy issue.
That addressed part of it, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Colleen?
I'm agreeing with the earlier questioner about the importance of the privatization, the corporatization of the punishment industry is a very key issue in terms of the future. It's already happening in a big way in the United States, so I'm just wondering if you have paid attention to that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, it creates a dynamic of its own that promotes these punitive values. I mean, in the United States, you have, if you go to the American Correctional Association conference, they have a whole bazaar of all these things. I mean, it's incredible, and all the lobbyists there promoting their products. And when I travel around the world, people tell me that these often American manufacturers are promoting those things in their countries as well, and with that, the punitive values that go with it. You know, there's a huge architectural lobby that lobbies to build prisons in the United States. Just architects alone, it's a business to build prisons, and so it absolutely. I do think it's important that politicians and the media, particularly the media, be educated on these things. They're often pretty ignorant about that. But I've chosen my particular part of this change strategy. I think it's, to do social change, you have to create doubt, and then you have to provide a positive vision. I've seen restorative justice as a way to get people to stop and think about, should we be punishing? If so, under what circumstances should we be punishing this much? Where are victims in this? To me, it's that I'm trying to create doubts about what we're doing and create another vision. I'm not a day-to-day political strategist, but again, I think maybe I'm going to put Barry on the spot and see what he thinks about that. But it is a huge issue. It is clear that it's part of the momentum. But it's not just the private. I mean, the public sector, if you want to read a really interesting read Jerry Miller's book called Last One Over the Wall. Jerry Miller was head of the juvenile justice system in Massachusetts years ago, and he tried to shut down all the secure institutions. And the strategies the system went to undercut him in that are phenomenal. It makes quite an interesting read, and that's part of the dynamic. So it's not just the privatization; it's bigger than that.
Thank you, Howard. Any other questions for Howard? Evelyn.
One of the challenges we face in restorative organizations and restorative practitioners is funding. I'm wondering what insights and advice you would give to us in terms of funding sources. And I've been wondering if we made strategically a little bit of an error in the early days of pushing so hard that restorative justice is cost effective, and that we could do this primarily as volunteers. And now the system, if they grant us space, they say, yes, go for it, but we won't fund you. So if you have any thoughts or insights, and
So does anybody have any easy questions?
no, sorry.
Well, we're facing that big in the U.S. right now with all the economic cutbacks, although I'm surprised how many programs still exist through all this. I think the argument that it's cost effective is a tricky one. It is in the long run if you really do it on a large scale, but it's really hard to test, you know, because it's easy to cherry pick cases, and it's just really hard to figure out. And I don't think it's the best argument. And you're right, it probably did get us in trouble. But I think we need to find incorporate it in a structural way, and not just have these little add-ons. And I think we haven't done enough conversations in the field itself. How we do this structurally? How do we build it in? How do we not just be this little add-on on the side? Which is partly why I think we need to have this dialogue around mass incarceration and how restorative justice might address that. I'm always torn because I have a real bias toward community-based, involving volunteers, involving people from the community from it, and yet if we're going to do it in a large scale, it's going to have to be more structured. I mean, the New Zealand practitioners say, yeah, our staff, we're paid to do this, and that's the only way you can do it on the scale we're doing it, and they're right. So I think we're still at the stage of sort of showing what can be done, learning the lesson. I sometimes say I wish we had another decade before Oprah Winfrey discovered restorative justice, because there's so much we don't know. I mean, we still need to be trying things out, experimenting. So I'm not sure or not whether we're ready to go big time. New Zealand is the closest thing to it, and I think we could really learn from that model about how to do it. And there are a few jurisdictions that are experimenting like that, but I would like someday the default to be that you go to a restorative process. What New Zealand did is to make a restorative for serious crime. The default is a restorative conference, and the court is a backup. So they've said the court is our scarce resource. We shouldn't be using it all the time. We can handle these things through caution and release, and for more serious crimes through these family group conferences, and keep the court for when it's needed, when people can't agree, when somebody denies their guilt, or for murder and manslaughter, and then they're still going to go back to a conference. And I haven't talked to them lately about this, but I had judges after they started this tell me I went from spending 5 days a week, all day on the bench dealing with youth matters, to half a day a week. It was that dramatic in the reduction of court resources that were used. So I think in the long run there's a real case to be made. My friend Ellen McCrae, who was youth justice coordinator for the capital city of Wellington for quite a while, he used to come and teach for us. Every year he came, they had lowered crime, and they had fewer conferences they were needing to do. The only crime that was going up was drug crimes, because the police had less to do and were arresting more, they were tracking drug crimes more. If we can do it on that scale, it definitely is a cost reduction. But when we do it on just individual cases, it's hard to make a convincing case sometimes. If you take Sujatha's story, if you think of the difference between, if this had been a death penalty case, the millions of dollars that jurisdiction would cost, versus what it costs to go through that conference and to spend 10 years or 20 years in prison, the savings were massive in that jurisdiction. So it's not that the argument can't be made.
Merlin, you've been waiting patiently. Go.
I'm just finding it interesting that we're talking against the corporatization and consumerization of the criminal justice system, but then kind of being upset that we're unable to corporatize or consumerize the restorative justice process. In my casual conversations with Liz, as not someone who is professionally or academically associated with restorative justice, my comment would be that her value was placed more on the volunteerism and the engagement of the community as a whole, as opposed to creating an executive or a professional class to implement it. And again, not as an academic or a professional in this field in any way.
Well, and that's my bias, and that's where my energy goes too. I've spent most of my years working with community groups rather than paid officials for that reason.
Thank you.
I really heard your sentiment about RJ needing to be done more at a structural level, and I'm wondering, do you, and if so, where do you see the best opportunity for embeddedness for RJ within the system at a smaller scale, or at sort of an introductory kind of in?
Well, there are a number of examples of communities where they really did embed it. Like many years ago, there was a community in upstate New York that had a jail crowding problem, and one of the candidates, Doug Call, ran for sheriff. He wasn't an ordinary sheriff candidate. He had a law and a theology degree, divinity degree, which is not your standard sheriff's profile in the U.S. But he said, look, we can do some things differently, and we won't need to build a new jail. And what they did is he worked very carefully with the defense and with the prosecutor and the defense community. And they created a system where, for serious crime, where that if that they would begin working with the victim right from the start, offering them input into bail decisions, maybe even communication, even working out possible sentences, and the judge would then allow them to start the sentence before they finalized it. And that and some other related kind of things. They never did build a new jail, as I understand it. They actually rented space to neighboring counties because they were able to move it out. And it was really embedded in that. So it was a collaborative effort, and I think that's what's so important, is getting the key actors on the same page and willing to work together on these instead of the more adversarial kind of relationship. So that'd be one way.
Thank you.